What's up, everyone? My name is Anthony Pieri, and I'm the pastor of Dot Church. And tonight we are talking about prayer. And you might think this is one of the less exciting topics, especially when you compare it to some of the spicy topics we've covered in the past. But as much as I love spending time tearing apart and deconstructing the messed up parts of Christianity in America, I am also a big believer in reconstructing the good parts of our faith. And prayer is a big one. Outside of reading the Bible or talking with other Christians, prayer is our main communication channel with God. And yet so many of us probably pray significantly less than we would like, or less than we feel we should. Many of us are plagued with guilt or envy, especially when we meet people who seem like prayer saturates their lives. Maybe you've met these people who seem to be praying all the time and thought to yourself, what do they understand that I don't? Or maybe you're watching this and you are that prayer warrior, in which case, hopefully this talk will help reinforce what you already know to be true. But honestly, I think the prayer warriors are in the minority. I don't have any stats to back this up, but I do trust my hunch. So I want to start this topic by asking a provocative question. Is prayer pointless? When you hear a pastor ask this question, obviously you think my answer is going to be no. But I'm going to be brutally honest here. I have lived maybe 98% of my life as if the answer to this question is yes. As in, yes, prayer is pointless. There was a day about 5 years ago where I was sitting in my bathroom in my wife and I's first apartment in downtown Chicago after recently getting married. I was in the bathroom because it was private and the apartment was small, and I was trying to spend time with God. And I was holding the open Bible in my hands and I was trying to pray. And I asked God, please give me a sign that prayer matters, that it actually does something, that it's not pointless. And I'm not saying that I heard an audible voice or anything, but a word and a number did pop into my head. My older brother and my old mentor were both more charismatic in their Christianity, meaning that they often heard words from the Lord. And so I was a little bit more able to discern between stuff that was just from my brain and thoughts that God had put in there himself. And I believe that God put this book of the Bible and a chapter into my head. In my head pops the words, Hezekiah 10. So immediately I'm like, maybe I need to look up what happens in the book of Hezekiah in chapter 10. And so I flip over to the table of contents and I'm thinking, this has got to be somewhere in the Old Testament. And I'll put the table of contents on the screen. Feel free to drop this in the chat below or the comment section when you see the book of Hezekiah. I'll give you a second. Yep, that's right. There is no book of the Bible called Hezekiah. And so I'm like, great. That was just from my own head and not from God. I guess no sign, prayer really is pointless. And this sealed the deal in my head because already I had major issues with understanding how prayer could not be pointless. And now I was even more convinced that it was. There were three big reasons that prayer always felt like a waste of time to me. And they were these. This was the first one. Prayer always seemed pointless for the first reason that if God is sovereign, meaning if he's all powerful, what he's planned to happen is going to happen regardless of what I pray. Now, what you got to understand is the type of Christianity I grew up with can broadly be referred to as Calvinism. It's a big concept with lots of sub points and smaller ideas, but it places a high value on the sovereignty of God. It's not just that nothing is outside of God's power, but that God is also the one actively bringing about everything that is happening. I heard in a podcast a pastor who embraces this view. He said that God gave him pancreatic cancer. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying people who believe this are wrong necessarily. There are a lot of verses in the Bible that would suggest God is behind everything that's happening. But an unhelpful byproduct is trying to work something like prayer into this scheme of theology. If God is ultimately in control and everything that's happening today was planned by God billions and billions of years ago, then it doesn't really seem like prayer could really make any difference, right? Like if you just think about it logically, isn't that the only real conclusion that you can come to? And so you hear pastors like the one I mentioned earlier talk about prayer as mainly a way for us to order our desires around what God desires and to pray in line with what God was already going to do. For example, they would take a verse like this: take delight in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. And they would say that you should interpret this verse to mean that God will give you not what you desire, but the right desires. If you're thinking about praying to God that he would give you a Tesla, the more that you take delight in the Lord, the more that you'll change that prayer to something like, help me be more generous. Do you see the distinction? Now, there is a lot of truth to this idea. If we are seeking after Jesus, our prayers probably will reflect more and more what he would want for our lives. But it's still hard to see prayer as an agent for changing our circumstances in this theological scheme. And so many people would say it's more about changing our hearts, which to me for many years meant that prayer felt pointless because I had real world things that I wanted to see happen, not just things in my own heart. And so I would usually vacillate between thinking prayer was pointless for that reason and thinking it was pointless for this reason. When I pray that God will do something, he usually doesn't do it. When I was in middle school, I had crushes on girls and prayed that they would want to date me, and they didn't. When I was in high school, I prayed that my band would get signed and get famous. It didn't. In my adulthood, I prayed that my best friend growing up would become a Christian. He still hasn't. I'm assuming you can fill in your own laundry list of prayers of things that have not been answered by God. It can be hard to keep up any amount of optimism in the face of all this consistent disappointment. But even if you've tried to pray in spite of those two reasons, usually we end up thinking it's pointless because of this third reason. And it's that prayer is extremely hard to do. You hear people talking about praying for multiple hours at a time, and you're thinking, what the heck could you be praying for during all that time? My prayer life was always characterized by me trying to get, all the stuff in the right place. I'd get up early, get into a nice spot, get my Bible out, maybe have a journal next to me, all the stuff that you see the Christian Instagram influencers posting about, and then I would get to work. But I'd start praying, and then immediately my mind would race in a ton of different directions. I'd start thinking about what I had to do for the rest of the day. And then I'd have to force myself to focus again. And then this would keep happening, and I'd feel more and more guilty, and then I would give up. It just seems so hard and leads to all this guilt and shame. And you think to yourself, I must be a terrible Christian. If I was a real Christian, I wouldn't have these problems. Prayer is so basic. And so I eventually would come to the conclusion that prayer is pointless from both a theological perspective and from these practical perspectives. And so how have I spent most of my life? Not praying. But I think that I had missed something crucial. And if you struggle with prayer, I think you might have missed it too. I want to talk about a story from the Bible that I think challenges these assumptions, or at least it challenges my assumptions and my theology. And it's from a part of the Bible that you might not have read, or if you have, it's probably not something that you've read recently. We're going to flip back into the Old Testament. The Bible, it's a big, long, complicated book. Actually, it's probably more accurate to call it a library of books than a single book. But the first half of the Bible, what was referred to as the Hebrew Scriptures, or what we Christians call the Old Testament, it's mainly this long story about the nation of Israel, which can be traced to modern day Jewish people. And we're going to read a section from the book of 2 Kings. At this point in the story, Israel, the nation, is divided into two major kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And each of them have had a long string of failed kings. Each king was basically more evil than the one that came before them. And it had gotten so bad that God had said, if you don't get your act together, I'm going to let the entire nation be conquered. And that's basically what happened to the northern kingdom. They actually were taken over by the Assyrians, which was like a massive superpower of the day, and deported in this forced exile. And so the southern kingdom is left by itself. And the Assyrians, they had set their sights on taking over them next. And so they mounted this big attack, but then God miraculously comes through and protects the land and drives them away. The king of the southern kingdom at this point is one of the only good kings that we've seen in the book so far. But his life is not getting any easier. We read this in chapter 20. It says this: about that time, the king became deathly ill, and the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos, went to visit him. He gave the king this message: this is what the Lord says, set your affairs in order, for you are going to die. You will not recover from this illness. Some of us, we wish that God would speak to us directly. Why don't you ever speak to me? I want to hear you audibly. But we probably wouldn't want to hear that message to us. But then it goes on. When the king heard this, he turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord. Remember, O Lord, how I have always been faithful to you and have served you single-mindedly, always doing what pleases you. Then he broke down and wept bitterly. The king appeals to God. He's crying out to God to deliver him from this illness. He's not being a stoic, always joyful Christian that we think we're supposed to be today. He's unabashedly weeping before God. Then what happens next? But before Isaiah had left the middle courtyard, this message came to him from the Lord. Go back to the king, the leader of my people. Tell him, this is what the Lord, the God of your ancestor David says. I have heard your prayer and I have seen your tears. I will heal you. And 3 days from now, you will get out of bed and go to the temple of the Lord. I will add 15 years to your life. And I will rescue you and this city from the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for my own honor and for the sake of my servant David. Then Isaiah said, make an ointment from figs. So the king's servant spread the ointment over the boil, and the king recovered. Now, let's pause for a second, because I don't want you to miss what just happened. God says the king is going to die. Then the king prays, and he doesn't die. If we want to put that in human terms, we might say that God changed his mind. If you're from a theological background like mine, you've probably got a ton of red flags going up. Whoa, slow down. God does not and cannot change his mind. That would challenge his power. That would challenge his sovereignty. It is passages like these that threaten the systems of theology that we've created. We read verses and we build ideas about what God can and cannot do. The fancy seminary word for this is systematic theology. But these stories remind us that we cannot put God in a box. Your logical Western brain is going to try to figure out how to synthesize this passage into your understanding of God's sovereignty. I'm going to encourage you to not do this. I want you to take this at face value and let it and God speak to you. Do you think that this king felt like his prayers were pointless? Probably not. He got a clear word from God, from a famous prophet. This is the same Isaiah from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. And then he prays, and Isaiah comes back and says, God heard your prayer and changed his mind and now decided you won't die today. You're going to live an extra 15 years. Now, there's a reason that this passage hit me so hard when I first read it. When I was alone and I prayed to God to give me that sign that God answers prayers, I thought God told me to look for a book of the Bible that didn't exist. It wasn't until months later that I was working through one of those Bible in a year reading plans that I got to chapter 20 in 2 Kings, the passage we just read. Do you want to know the name of the king in the story? I left it out for this reason. His name was Hezekiah. I was praying to God to give me a sign that he answers prayers, and he pointed me to this exact story, a story I had never read or ever heard preached in a sermon. He literally incepted that name into my brain. And I never knew that it was the exact story about someone who prayed and got their prayer answered until I got to that part in the Bible reading plan. This completely reframed my theology up to this point. It messed with all my categories, but it also made God more alive and real to me. But here's the thing, even though I had this new head knowledge related to my prayer life didn't actually get much better. In fact, for the next 5 years, I still struggled with making prayer a regular part of my life. Because just like anything, having head knowledge doesn't always lead to change behavior. It wasn't until I read this book called A Praying Life by a guy named Paul Miller that I actually started to take some of that head knowledge and bring it into practical usage. This book starts basically in the same place that I started, with all those very real objections. But then not only does it challenge them, it also gives a way to actually start the journey of prayer. And so my thought was, we need to try to get Paul Miller on Church to talk about this. I reached out, and unfortunately he's like this big famous author and has more important things to do than to come on our dinky Zoom calls. But his organization did reach back out and connect me to Keith Grant, who is the guest with us tonight. And so Keith is going to come on and we're going to go more into the in-depth ways to actually practice the praying life that Paul Miller talks about. And if you remember when I gave a talk about the J curve, this is the same author who also wrote that book. And so during our time together, Keith and I would encourage you to send in your questions. And if you're watching this video later, you can add your questions below. But I'll link to that video now, and we hope that you will join us watching over there.